Hello viewers and welcome to a special video production for Warhammer 40,000 Conquest. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Long ago, I began a series of Warlord-focused interviews which I then called Community Spotlights, and wanting to leave no project unfinished, today, after far too long a hiatus, I seek to complete another such interview for one of the two Planetfall Cycle Warlords I've yet to cover, Archon Salaine Morn. So, Travis, I've made it no secret that you're the party responsible for designing almost every deck I've ever attempted to play competitively, and I can hardly believe it's taken me this long to finally have you on the channel. But please take a moment to introduce yourself and let our listeners and viewers know just how it is that you're involved in our Conquest community.
Hello everyone, my name is Travis and I'm also known as I Fight Dragons on CardGameDB and on Octagon. I largely participate in the community through discussions on the Skype group, posting comments on the Facebook group, and helping organize the Ohio scene. I also occasionally post on the CardGameD forums. I also recently put up a Broderick War guide for my self-proclaimed Tempo War. Feel free to check that out as well. I consider myself a pretty good player at this game, and I always try to share and expand my insights into becoming the best player out there.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate all your help for me while I was in the Black Crusade and even just getting ready for my local regionals. So you and I are a couple of guys that have been in pretty constant contact just through the power of the internet. We met at Worlds, and you all around seem like a pretty damn decent guy. But Travis, how was it that you first turned an eye toward gaming? Like, what was your humble beginning, and what exactly resulted in your turning your attention to Conquest?
I've kind of been a gamer almost my entire life. Back when I was really young, my first interaction with gaming was with a Sega Genesis that my dad had. And that was back when I was like barely able to walk. I was playing on this thing, not even knowing what I was doing. But I grew up on video games, and around the time I got into elementary school, I was out camping with Boy Scouts, and because camping is quite frankly boring for a bunch of 6-year-old boys, a bunch of the older kids brought Magic the Gathering, and it was my first introduction to card games. And despite, barely being able to do math and understand a lot of the basic concepts fully, I fell in love with the game. And throughout my life, me and my little brother, we played all sorts of card games, from Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, Pokemon, the Dragon Ball Z card game, the Shaman Kings card game, the Star Wars collectible card game, Digimon, and Duel Masters. We went to tournaments. We did the whole thing. I can't imagine how many countless thousands of dollars my parents must have sunk into little cardboard pieces of cardboard with art on them for us. But it was a lot of fun. So before I got into Conquest, I was really into Netrunner. I kind of picked it up as a side game to Magic because I was kind of having a falling out with it because the competitive scene was kind of stale, and honestly a lot of people were taking it just like a bit too seriously for a card game, and so I was just looking for something new. I fell in love with Netrunner and FFG's LCG model. I played that for a good 4 or 5 years. Conquest was announced. Well, it wasn't quite 4 or 5 years, but it was quite a few years. When Conquest was announced, I was really excited to get my hands on it because it was a 40k card game, and having tried to get into the miniatures game but finding my wallet not quite big enough, it was a nice way to experience some more 40k, which is quite an interesting universe to say the least.
Well, I guess why stick with it? Once you'd given it a try, once you had the established history with Netrunner, and clearly you're no stranger to card games, but why stay faithful to Conquest nowadays?
It's an interesting question, because at first I thought Conquest was hot garbage. I tried it with one core set, and I found it just like wildly snowbally and inconsistent, and all the other things that a lot of people who like play Conquest and then hate it would say. It just becomes like a First Planet War, and then if you lose, then it's just going to snowball because now you're behind and you can't come back, yada, yada, yada. But it wasn't until Worlds, where I saw Jeremy's Warren and Davis's game, that I sort of saw just like the potential, like the insane amount of skill required. And if you haven't seen that game, I highly recommend anyone out there go watch it, because those players are just insane. It blew my mind what happened. So I decided to give it another go. I bought the 2 extra core sets needed, and I just started to get good at the game, and I fell in love with the intense complexity and the amount of choices you have to make that ultimately influence the outcome of the game. It's not one big play that wins you a game of Conquest, but a ton of incremental little things and optimizations that'll get you there. It's also not so much about the cards you're running in your deck. There's no, like, I don't know, like super OP, I put this card on the table and I win card in Conquest. It's more about how you leverage the cards that you do have in your deck and how you get optimal use out of them that pulls the game towards your side, because Conquest is ultimately a struggle in everything. It's a struggle for planets, a struggle for command, and you just need to put more on your side than it is your opponent, and it's about treading that line. It's really just unlike anything I've ever done.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is just such an incredibly rich game, and it feels akin to playing 3 to 5 different games of Magic the Gathering all at once, but I'm quite fond of it myself. But, Travis, flash forward beyond the days of the core set, beyond the Warlords cycle. We recently did complete our Planetfall cycle. We've opened up a couple deluxe expansions, and when we sit down to record this interview, we're in the midst of the Death World cycle. So I haven't really had the opportunity to talk to anyone in depth about Archon Salaine Morn, and you've at least dabbled in almost every Warlord for this game, but just in talking about our third Dark Eldar Warlord option, what exactly are some of her strengths, and what does she do well? Like, what might be the impetus or compulsion for someone to give Archon Salaine Morn a try?
Certainly. I think the main reason to play Morn right now is that she has a very strong economic engine. I view her very much as just like a warlord that is very much about the command game and controlling the economy that she receives and leveraging that insane economy that she can generate into a significant advantage in the game. She's also very, very unpredictable. When you're sitting there and you're holding anywhere from 4 to 10 resources, even more at times, I've seen crazy amounts up to 26 in my regional game against Gentry playing one.
Dear God.
Who's holding 26 resources. It becomes very difficult for your opponent to kind of play around everything, right? Because so much is on the table, from Klavex War Leader, Warpstorm, Archon's Terror, Shadowed Thorns Pillagers, you've got Rapid Assault, and all these other sort of ways for your opponent to just ruin your day, and it just becomes very difficult to play around it all. And sometimes she just has so many that it doesn't matter if you played around it. It's just too much. She also, another very overlooked thing, or maybe not so overlooked, but something that's like not so obvious, is her base stats are like the best of any warlord in the game. A 2/7 into a 2/6 is phenomenal. She is very hard to actually assassinate and push off of planets, so you can sort of even just take planets with her alone and like back her up with cards in hand. It's quite strong.
Yeah, I mean, just talking about all the different options she's got available to her, certainly there are just countless different ways to build Archon Salaine Morn, just because she's got so many Kabalite synergy options. She does pretty well allied with Chaos, and she also does pretty well allied with Eldar. Do you think that she has any kind of glaring weaknesses, or is there anything which she does poorly?
Yeah, I think she definitely has a few. I think her main weakness is that she's pretty reliant on command. Luckily, she's very good at command and dominating it. But if your opponent is playing like a choke deck, or they can contest your command and deny you specifically cards, she can sort of flounder a bit because 20 resources doesn't do much if you've only got 2 cards a turn.
Right.
And that at that point you're pretty much relying on quite a bit of luck to draw into the exact tricks you need in order to win the fight. But if you can secure those cards, then again, she's just a force to be reckoned with. Another small weakness I would say is that I think she's got a bit more of a chance of drawing poorly, especially with the starting hand. The thing about tricks and a bit about her deck balance is trying to fit as many tricks in as she can, but not so much that you're drawing into a bunch of tricks in your starting hand and having very, very poor starts to the game. So a lot of it is is mulliganing and knowing when to mulligan for the right hand. And sometimes you're just going to draw a hand of like 5 events and then only 2 playable units on turn 1, and you're just going to have to roll with it and play well to bring that back.
Yeah. I mean, just comparing her to natural point of comparison like Packmaster Kith, instead of these kind of vanilla units or whatever else that are just kind of like a Slith Mercenary is a perfect example. It's stats on a stick, as opposed to something like Raiding Portal, which requires some careful thought and setup and some favorable draws to kind of come your way in sequence to allow you to pull off a very powerful combo. There's just a little bit more planning involved.
Yeah, and one other weakness I think that she has is that a lot of her units, her specific units, have very low attack value.
Right.
So, like, almost everything she has is going to only be attacking for 2, so it can be completely shielded, which makes it a little trickier to trigger a Clavex. And also, it can just be really hard for her to deal with big options short of just drawing an Archon's Terror. On top of that as well, I think another minor weakness is just a lack of options for Swarm Control. The main option she'll have is Warp Storm, but if you want to go Eldar allies, that's completely off limits, and you've kind of just got to go for outstatting the other guy with bigger units, or God forbid, taking Cabalite Strike Force.
Right. Such a popular option. But, you know, when it all comes down to it, what do you feel that some of her best matchups are? Which, Warlords as opponents really help to illustrate some of her greatest strengths?
Certainly. I think she's pretty alright against specifically Zerathur and Tau. Zerathur has a hard time dealing with a lot of tricks from hand, especially if you can pressure him off of planets where he's command sniping, or you can flood the board after he uses like a Plague Beast in order to dodge that damage, and you force him to like Warp Storm and take a bunch of self damage. Morn herself is particularly tanky as well, and she can't be hit by a lot of his tricks, like the Flamers or the Firestorm, so she can actually sort of toe-to-toe him as well. So I think that she's got a pretty strong Zerathur matchup specifically. I wouldn't say Chaos in general, because I think Kugath can be a real problem at times, having that extra dueling ability of his. For Tau, they kind of just fall apart to any sort of like control, and they're very much about this one big swingy play, and then Morn can just hold back tricks, or Clavex their big unit, or Archon's Terror their big unit, and it's sort of they just kind of crumble after that. And finally, I think she's slightly strong against Space Marines in general, because Space Marines also have this sort of necessity for keeping like their units in the combat. They're very much about just straight up fights, and so Dark Eldar, being a faction full of these combat tempo tricks, can really screw with that sort of plan.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that she can sometimes struggle with swarms and things like that. Which decks, which factions, warlords do you think she has the hardest time against, and why?
The 2 big ones for me are Broderick War and Kith. Broderick War is tricky for her to deal with because he's got an outstanding command game, as well as going very wide with his units. This is mainly where her weakness of like low attack values can come into play as well, because his units can more often than not be saved with a single shield, or if they're playing with like the bunkers as well, that can really screw with stuff. You're pretty reliant on getting like a game sweeping Warp Storm, but sometimes that's just not possible with troop transports and Elysian Assault teams ready to flood the board back up again. Another one for me is Kith. Kith, I think, is actually kind of a big one. It really depends on your draw, and Kith will more often than draw more consistently, so you need to draw really well, I think, in order to handle the just constant value of 2/1 tokens coming your way. On top of that, she has a lot of the same tricks as you do, so you're just as vulnerable as she is. Eldorath is also kind of worth mentioning, I think, just simply because as a trick-based warlord, he can kind of shut you down. He's got to remember that Nullify exists, which, spoilers, that's why I lost Nationals, is that I forgot Nullify exists. And exhausting units, it's never fun. So I think Eldorath, it might be closer to 50-50, but I think I'd put that a little bit more on Eldorath just because of his ability to deal with a lot of Dark Eldar shenanigans.
Well, certainly when it comes down to it, we've talked about there are a lot of different ways to build an Archon Salaine Morn deck. So when it comes to deck building, when it comes to actual gameplay, where do you personally lie? Like, what are some of your favorite units, cards, combos to include and try to pull off? Are you more Chaos or Eldar aligned? Like, what's your personal ASM playstyle?
Cool. So I lean her more towards an economic powerhouse. I think the way to win with her is to just sort of get a ton of resources and cards, and just sort of shut out the other person out of economy, and just sort of basically just outpace them. You're just going to grow big, and you're going to grow big fast. It's just how it works. I lean currently more towards Chaos allies. Simply for the extra command, which works well with that economic thing, but also Warp Storm is a big deal in the current meta of like Weenie Swarm decks. Eldar allies are also very, very viable, don't get me wrong. They have like the extra bully and punch, which, trust me, she really likes, and you can also, you get, like, if you really want, you can run superiority and get that extra command anyway.
Yes, such a ubiquitously popular card.
Some like it, some don't.
Yeah. But I guess when it comes down to using Archon Salaine Morn as a unit, let's say you've carefully constructed your Chaos allied deck and you're going to be going for command, how do you go about, just starting a game to working your way slowly toward, hopefully, a win?
Alright, so I think a strong opening hand with Morn will have like a few cheap units. Harriers in particular are fantastic on turn 1. A promotion is also not looked at, and then either Archon's Palace or Raiding Portal are amazing to get early into the game. It might even be worth mulliganing for either on turn 1 because they just shape the scape of the command game throughout the entire game. Raiding Portal I find specifically to be very powerful early game because there's always going to be at least one red planet, and you'll be able to leverage it to either reinforce planets for combat or to shut down command later down the line. It's one of the few supports in the game that I feel is like up there with forward barracks in terms of how it actually changes the scape of how your opponent has to play around it.
Sure.
Entirely, and it can get out of control. One thing about it though is you really want to see it early. Raiding Portal falls off quite significantly, I find, after turn like 3 or 4. When the planets start to fall off, it becomes far less useful, especially if the later planets don't have any red.
Yeah. Your logic totally checks out. But I guess once you do have that opening hand, maybe you're able to abuse Raiding Portal. You win some command struggles upstream, you relocate your units, you win additional command struggles, hopefully flipping some command struggles a little bit further down the line. Do you, and it's tricky without knowing the exact planet layout, but do you generally bully early on with Archon Salaine Morn, or just snipe economy units, or what are your thoughts there?
It honestly depends. If I feel that, like, based on, I got everything, Conquest depends. That's kind of a null answer. But let's say, for example, that the win condition, like say Planet 1 is a very valuable planet in terms of icons for like a turn 4 or turn 5 victory. And if my opponent doesn't expect me to, Morn can more often not handle 1 or 2 units on her own. If you have any sort of ambush in hand, then it's not even a contest. I will often surprise people by just going and facing a Blood Angels veteran one-on-one and still winning that planet.
Yeah.
But if you need to get your economic engine going, or if you have the Raiding Portal but it's easily stopped by your opponent sniping it, sometimes you've just got to bite the bullet and send Morn to where you're already winning command just to secure the Raiding Portal. And if you do get Raiding Portal and you manage to flip a command later down the line, then you also essentially sent your Warlord there too. So that's the way I think about it. So the commits with her, it's a bit half and half. You want her in like just about any crucial battle, I think, where especially if she has her attachment, because that -3 attack is huge, and your opponents more often than not won't have that many 2-shielders. And if they're shielding her attack, or if they're shielding that, then they can't shield that and Harriers and the other units, and it opens up things like Clavex a bit more as well.
Well, just talking a little bit about deck composition, what is interesting about Dark Eldar is they've got such radically different looking decks. Like Urian, of course, goes heavy on torture events. He's got really light economy, whether he wants it or not. Packmaster Kith, I think everybody could probably describe a Kith deck in their sleep at this point, and Archon Salaine Morn is largely about tricks and Kabalites. So what are some of those cards that you include with Archon Salaine Morn that a Kith player is unlikely to pick and Urian would not be caught dead with?
Well, I don't run any torture events to my knowledge, so that's a few things different from Urian right there. Right. But as far as the deck building with Morn goes, I try to have enough Kabalites / Raiders to at least trigger her ability about once a turn. Her ability is not like the biggest deal in the world either. It's really nice, don't get me wrong, but like if she's bloodied, you don't care that much because you're just so resource heavy anyways. So I try to keep it to about 10 to, 13-ish Kabalites. So I think that the Kabalite Harriers are like a must-of 3 of forever, because, or at least so long as that there is Clavex War Leader, and so long as there are 1 HP command cappers, that card will see value, I think.
Sure.
I very much am a fan of the Slith Mercenary as well, which I guess that's sort of like a ubiquitous Dark Eldar card, but especially so in Morn. I think it was sort of like a Morn-made card with the amount of resource generation that she can make. It's just ekes value. On top of that, Raiding Portal, again, is a must-include, I think, of at least, I'd say at least 1 copy, but I find a home with like 2 of that and 2 of Palace right now, where I think it's just such a strong card, and it puts such a burden on your opponent to deal with it, or else they just kind of have to go all in on winning planets, because you're just going to get so much economy out of it that you storm the game. Rapid Assault is another one worth mentioning. I don't think I currently run it in a lot of my builds, because it's just kind of one of those cards that requires a lot of moving pieces to line up, but if you line it up, it is one of the most powerful events in the game, especially when you consider her ability effectively making it 1 cost. And if you trigger that with the Marauders, the Kabalite Marauders, I can't remember the full name, but you can essentially bring in 3 ready Kabalites for 1 resource, and that's pretty strong.
Yeah, it definitely is one of those cards that requires quite a bit of setup. Something I did want to specifically ask you about, just because a lot of people thought that it was the glue that would eventually tie an Archon Salaine Morn deck together, and I don't know if it necessarily turned out to be that way, is the Shadowed Thorns Venom, that big 5-cost 4/4 elite, where after you deploy it, you can move each Kabalite army unit you control to a red planet, and you can move each Kabalite to a different planet. I suppose, what's your just general opinion on that elite?
I think it's a very strong elite. I think it's well worth the cost of 5. Particularly because it is a raider, right? You do get the resource back as well.
Yes.
Yeah. I have tinkered with it. I don't think I would run more than 1 personally, just because its effect is very situational. It doesn't quite have the stats where, like, I think when I play it, I want to get the effect. I want to use the effect to reposition everything at Planet 1, or to refocus out all of my HQ after having a big Planet 1 fight, so that I can win command this turn. So it's quite strong. Speaking of elites, Morn can and very likely will be one of the better elite deck builds for Dark Eldar, particularly splashing Chaos. I think the Venomous Fiend in particular has been seeing some play in my meta with Morn, using the Teleportarium as well as Raiding Portal, so that your entire army just sort of shifts all over the place and snipes their command and wins you command and goes to the first planet now, and then you have to deal with all that after losing all the command struggles. So it's really fun. I think it's a deck that's not quite there, but like when it goes hard.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly sounds like it just, not only are you smothering your opponent's command, but you're also dismantling the individual pieces. It just sounds like it's significant enough that you should be paying attention to it.
Yeah.
But when it all comes down to it, do you view Archon Salaine Morn as truly competitive? Some people were thinking she may overtake Packmaster Kith as the, preeminent tier 1 option. How do you think she matches up?
I think she matches up pretty close, but not quite to Cigar level. She has a lot of really great economic options, but again, her weaknesses, particularly in like a swarm meta, are quite glaring. Maybe if we go more towards an elite meta, she'll become quite a bit stronger because she does have quite a few answers to those big units. It's also a case of, I think right now, a lot of the meta is a lot of the meta is becoming more mobility based rather than just strictly elite based. We see a lot of these Eldar vehicle decks with high mobility doing quite well. Whether or not that'll change over time because players get better or not is yet to be seen. But while she does have some mobility in Raiding Portal, I think that if you were going to take specifically like the Wild Rider Viper Wild Rider Squadron combo from Eldar, you're probably better off doing that in Kith rather than Morn.
Well, let's say that someone is really struggling to beat Archon Salaine Morn. Maybe they're more used to Kith's kind of smothering, choking, blanketing economy playstyle, and they're getting picked apart by the Kabalite Harriers plus Clavex War Leader and all the Kabalites that can relocate themselves and just all sorts of that nastiness. Can you give any suggestions or advice or basic tips for how to stand a chance against ASM if somebody's just having a hell of a time?
Right. I think the first thing to any sort of trick-based deck is to know what the tricks are. You have to sort of understand what is possible. Look at her allies, for example. For starts, I should say. If you see Chaos allies, you have to expect Warp Storm. I think it's just too good of a card to not expect at this point. Even if she's not running it, just expect it and be ready for it. If you see Eldar allies, you've got to be prepared for like beefier units like the Warlock Destructor. You got to be prepared for Shuriken Catapult, the Rogue Superiority, stuff like that. And from there, I'd say the main focus of the game will be economic for you. She does play really strongly economically, and she's going to try to shut you out. But I think the way to be that is to limit her options and fight back rather than let her go full Hamtaro on you. Specifically, cards are important. Again, I mentioned earlier that she really kind of falls apart if she doesn't have enough cards to play. She sort of basically loses her advantage in terms of resource economy if she doesn't have the cards to spend all those resources. So cards, focus on card planets, win commanded card planets, snipe card planets. Barless, make her discard cards. If you're Kith or Dark Eldar or Urian, just make her discard cards. Focus those out. And finally, being trick-based, counter-based effects like Nullify and Backlash will absolutely ruin her if she has to expend one of her really powerful things like a Clavex War Leader and just have it get straight-up countered.
Right. Well, I guess just speaking more generally as we wrap up today's interview, because you've got a long history of Conquest behind you by now, is there anything you just feel is worth sharing to maybe some of the newer players watching this video to help them improve, or even the more advanced and intermediate persons like myself could still stand to learn quite a lot? So any just general advice or tips that you'd like to toss out there into the warp?
Sure. For Archon Salaine Morn specifically, I think she's a strong economically focused warlord. Great for players who want to control the game, but not in the more direct way of exhaust this, cancel that, route that. Well, still route that sometimes. When played well, she dictates the pace of the game and is one of the most explosive warlords in the game when she gets going. If you want to get better at Conquest in general, I strongly feel the best way is to just play a ton of games. Just get out there, get on Octagon, go to your local meta meetups, find people, meet up all the time, play Conquest whenever you're free. Okay.
Sure.
No free time except for Conquest. Your life is for the Emperor. Losing is the best way to improve, I feel, because every time you lose, it's a lesson. That's a quote from somewhere, I'm sure. You can look at where you could have played better or done something better, and then use that information in future games. And over the course of even so many as 10 games, you improve significantly, trust me. Don't let anxiety about playing a player you think is better than you shy you away from those games, because that's often the best way to learn what you're doing wrong, is to get completely stomped by a good player. And most of us, I feel, in the Conquest community are great guys, and we want everyone to have fun and improve if that's what they want to do. So we'll give you any sort of advice or tips if you ask us. Finally, I think a great place if you want to actually get good at competitive in general is to read the short book entitled Playing to Win by David Serlin. He was a Street Fighter 4 competitive player, or not Street Fighter 4, but Street Fighter 2 player back in the day. And I think it's got a lot of interesting insights on how you should view competitive games and balance and other things like that specifically that I personally have found very helpful for when I was starting to try and get into that competitive mindset.
Yeah, well, that's by no means the first time I've heard that recommended, so I think it's probably definitely worth checking out. And really the last question I have for you today is, do you believe that, considering the game is moving more in the direction of elites, we've yet to see spoiled or revealed or anything, fourth Dark Eldar Warlord, do you believe that Archon Salaine Morn is the future of a DE competitive play?
I think that she is definitely a future, but not the future. I think Fantasy Flight did a fantastic job with Morn, because they made Dark Eldar wider but not taller. They gave it more options without making it overpowered.
Sure.
Very, very little things changed for Kith. The Cavalite Harriers might see a splash. Gut and Pillage is seeing a splash because Kith really wants those resources. But for the most part, Morn is just a different style to Dark Eldar that still fits the theme. And I think Planetfall in general really did that overall, different styles while still being very thematic, and I would consider it very successful. I can't wait to see what Morn gets in the future.
Definitely. Well, I wholeheartedly agree, and I suppose just to bring things to a close, if any of the listeners and viewers want to get in touch with you, how could they go about doing that again?
For the most part, you can find me on Facebook. My name is Travis McDaniel. You'll find me in the Facebook group. I pop in from time to time to answer Bulls questions just when they happen to pop up and I'm at my PC. You can find me on Card Game DB. I believe it's I Fight Dragons with no spaces, just a straight look. And then on Octagon, you can find me with I Fight Dragons with underscores between I Fight and Dragons. So those are the main ways. I do have Twitter, but I mean, you can post there. It's at Travis Fights Dragons, but you'll be lucky if I notice that it's there.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Travis. To anyone who made it this far, just let us know in the comments, what have your own play experiences been running Archon Salaine Morn? Do you feel she measures up to Kith? What are some of your favorite tips and tricks and strategies? If you ever want to get in touch with me, of course, I'm the Hive Tyrant on Twitter, Facebook, really pretty much anywhere, and I spend far too much time online, so I'm very easy to get a hold of. If you ever want to support this channel, I'm on Patreon as well, but if you enjoyed this interview, hit the share button so that more people end up being exposed to Conquest. But as always, thank you so much for watching and thank you for listening. And be sure to check back in again soon for much more Conquest LCG content to come.